There are moments in history when silence speaks louder than words, when a room full of power, authority, and influence suddenly falls quiet, not because there is nothing to say, but because something has just been said that cannot be ignored. Something so direct, so unshakable, so true, that the most powerful voices in the world are left without an answer. And that is what happened when Jaishankar, representing a nation that for far too long had been underestimated, stood his ground, looked America in the eye, and uttered two simple words that carried with them the weight of centuries, the strength of 1 billion people, and the confidence of a rising global power, two words that silenced America. Now, let us not mistake this silence for weakness. Silence in that moment was not surrender, it was recognition that the balance of the world is shifting. Recognition that India is no longer a nation to be spoken for, lectured to, or dictated terms by. Recognition that in this century, the voices of the global south, the voices of emerging powers, the voices of those who endured struggle and rose through it, will be heard. You see, for decades, the story of global power was written by a few nations. They set the rules, they defined the terms, and they expected others to follow. And for a long time, many did. Some out of necessity, some out of fear, some out of habit. But what happens when one of those nations, once seen as a developing giant, once written off as too chaotic, too diverse, too fragmented, decides to rise? What happens when that nation grows its economy, invests in its people, strengthens its military, builds its technology, and asserts its culture? What happens when that nation, with the world's largest democracy, the youngest population, and one of the oldest civilizations, stands up and says, "Enough, that is what India has done." And Jaishankar, with two words, made it clear. Now, if you've ever heard him speak, you'll know that he doesn't raise his voice, he doesn't need to, he doesn't pound the table, he doesn't make threats, he simply speaks with calm, with clarity, with conviction. And in those two words, he distilled the essence of India's foreign policy today, unapologetic, self-assured, and sovereign. Two words that told America, and by extension the world, that India will not be a pawn in someone else's game. India will not be pressured into choosing sides. India will not be shamed into submission. India will stand, as it always has, on its own terms. And in that silence that followed, there was a realization. A realization in Washington, in Brussels, in every capital that had once looked at India as a junior partner, that those days are gone. Friends, let us understand why this moment mattered. For years, America has seen itself as the moral compass of the world. It has often demanded loyalty, demanded alignment, demanded that others fall in line with its vision of democracy, of freedom, of order. And yet, at times, those same ideals have been bent to serve its own interests. Nations in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, they have seen this, they have lived it. They have borne the costs of wars they did not start, sanctions they did not deserve, interventions they did not invite. And India, with its history of colonial rule, with its memory of being told what to do, has always understood the price of silence. But this time, India chose a different silence. A silence after two words that spoke louder than anything America had said in return. What were those two words? Some may say they were our choice. Some may say they were no lecture. Others may believe they were sovereign decision. The exact phrase does not matter as much as the truth behind it. Because in those two words, Jaishankar captured a sentiment that resonated across continents, the right of every nation to decide its own destiny, the right to make decisions based not on pressure from the powerful, but on the needs of its own people. The right to say no when no is the only answer consistent with dignity, and America, for all its power, had no response, because how do you argue with dignity? How do you challenge sovereignty? How do you silence a voice that speaks not just for one country, but for an entire movement of nations rising to claim their place at the table? This is not about anti-Americanism. It is not about confrontation. It is about balance. It is about respect. It is about building a world where power is not concentrated in the hands of a few, but shared by many. A world where cooperation matters more than coercion. A world where dialogue replaces dictates, and in that vision, India stands tall. Now, let us think about what it takes for a nation to reach this point. India did not get here overnight. It has been decades in the making. From the painful years of partition to the struggles of poverty, from wars at its borders to battles within its economy, from being dismissed as a fragile democracy to being recognized as the largest and most vibrant democracy in the world, India's journey has been one of resilience. And with every challenge, it grew stronger. With every setback, it learned. With every insult, it found resolve. Today, when India speaks, the world listens, not because of its size alone, not because of its market alone, but because of its credibility, because India has shown that it can engage with the West without being dominated by it, and it can engage with the East without being bound by it. Because India has shown that it can build partnerships with Russia, with America, with Europe, with Africa, with Asia, not out of weakness, but out of strength. Because India has shown that multipolarity is not a threat, it is the future. And this is what silenced America, not fear, but respect. Not defeat, but recognition. Recognition that a new chapter is being written. Recognition that the era of unipolar dominance is over. Recognition that the tables have turned, not through force, but through conviction, discipline, and the quiet confidence of a nation that knows its worth. Now, I want you to imagine that moment again. A crowded hall filled with diplomats, leaders, journalists, analysts. Every question asked with the assumption that India would bend, that India would justify, that India would explain itself. And then Jaishankar speaks. Calm, direct, 2 words, and suddenly the air changes. People shift in their seats. Pens stop moving. Cameras zoom in, and then silence. That silence was history. That silence was India stepping into its role as a global leader, not by demand, but by presence. Not by threat, but by truth. Not by echoing others, but by speaking for itself. And as we look ahead, let us be clear, this was not an isolated moment. This was not a sound bite to be forgotten. This was a declaration of intent. Because India's rise is not temporary, it is not accidental, it is deliberate, it is strategic, it is inevitable. And every time India stands its ground, every time India asserts its sovereignty, every time India silences doubt with dignity, the world edges closer to a future where power is not feared, but shared. That is why America was silenced. That is why the world is watching. And that is why history will remember those 2 words, not just as a diplomatic exchange, but as the moment the balance of global power shifted, the moment India's voice could no longer be ignored, the moment silence became the loudest sound in the room. Underestimating India today means misreading the future of world order, because when you underestimate a nation that carries within it one of the oldest civilizations on Earth, one of the youngest populations in the world, and one of the fastest growing economies, you fail to see the new foundation upon which global power is being rebuilt. When you underestimate a country that has endured centuries of colonial exploitation, fought its way back with resilience, and risen through waves of economic and technological revolutions, you are not just miscalculating a partner, you are miscalculating history itself. For India is not a nation that waits for permission to rise. It is a nation that rises because it must, because its people will it, and because its destiny demands it. The future of the world order is not going to be written by 1 or 2 powers sitting in distant capitals dictating the rules of engagement. The future will be multipolar, interconnected, and inclusive of voices that for far too long were silenced or sidelined. And in this multipolar world, India is not an afterthought. India is central. It is central not only because of its size, its geography, its market, or its military. It is central because it embodies the balance that the world desperately needs. A balance between tradition and modernity, between East and West, between development and democracy, between sovereignty and cooperation. For decades, analysts in the West wrote off India as chaotic, as divided, as incapable of playing on the global stage. They looked at its democracy and called it messy. They looked at its economy and called it fragile. They looked at its politics and called it unstable. And yet today, those same analysts are forced to reckon with a reality they never predicted. India is the world's fastest growing major economy. It is the hub of digital innovation and a leader in space technology. It is a nuclear power with a modernizing military. It is a nation that has lifted millions out of poverty while maintaining the integrity of democratic debate. And more than that, it is a nation that speaks with confidence in its own voice, not in the echo of someone else's. The lesson here is clear. To underestimate India is to misunderstand what drives global transformation. The world order that was built after the Second World War was one of dominance, of spheres of influence, of rules made by the few and enforced on the many. But that order is being challenged not by chaos, not by collapse, but by the emergence of countries like India who refuse to be bound by outdated hierarchies. And when Jaishankar, representing this India, speaks with the clarity of two words that silence even the most powerful voices, he is not just speaking for New Delhi. He is speaking for a new era of international relations, one where respect cannot be demanded, it must be earned, and where sovereignty cannot be compromised, it must be honored. Let us think about what that means for the future. For America, for Europe, for China, for Russia, for Africa, for Latin America, for all who will shape the coming century. To underestimate India is to assume that the old methods of persuasion and pressure will still work. To underestimate India is to imagine that the country will pick sides because it is told to. To underestimate India is to think that it can be lectured into submission. But those assumptions crumble in the face of reality. India does not bend to pressure. It weighs its interests, it consults its people, it studies the long arc of history, and it makes decisions on its own terms. Whether in trade, in security, in climate change, or in technology, India approaches the table as an equal, not a subordinate. This is not arrogance, it is confidence. It is the confidence of a nation that has seen the price of subjugation and will not pay it again. It is the confidence of a people who know that democracy, however noisy, however contested, is still their greatest strength. It is the confidence of leaders who understand that in a fractured world, their country can serve as a bridge between powers, a mediator between extremes, a voice of reason where there is only rhetoric. And when you underestimate that confidence, you not only misread India, you misread the direction of humanity's future, because let us be clear, the future is not going to be dominated by one power telling everyone else what to do. The future will be collaborative, the future will be negotiated, the future will belong to nations that can command respect not through intimidation, but through legitimacy, and India's legitimacy is rooted not just in its present strength, but in its civilizational depth. For thousands of years, India has given the world philosophy, mathematics, science, spirituality, and art. It has absorbed invaders, embraced diversity, and forged unity in contradiction. And today, as it steps forward, it carries all of that into the conversations that shape the world order. So when policymakers in Washington or Brussels underestimate India, they fail to see that India does not need validation to prove its relevance. Its relevance is already written in its numbers, in its achievements, in its growing influence across Asia, Africa, and beyond. They fail to see that India is not waiting for a seat at the table. It is building its own table and inviting others to join. They fail to see that when India speaks of sovereignty, of self-reliance, of cooperation without coercion, it is not posturing. It is outlining the principles by which the next century will operate. And here lies the truth that silences even the mightiest powers. India's rise is not about replacing one hegemon with another. It is about dismantling the very idea of hegemony. It is about proving that a country can grow strong without dominating others, that it can lead without dictating, that it can partner without enslaving. To underestimate, that is to cling to an old world order that is already crumbling. To underestimate, that is to believe that dominance can still be disguised as leadership. To underestimate, that is to misread the desires of billions of people across the global south, who look to India as proof that dignity and progress can walk hand in hand. Think of what this means for young people in Africa, in Southeast Asia, in Latin America. They look at India and see a mirror of their own aspirations, a nation once dismissed, now demanding respect, a people once bound, now breaking free, a voice once silenced, now shaping the conversation. And when America falls silent in the face of India's words, those young people take notice. They see that power is shifting. They see that it is possible to rise without surrender. They see that the world order is not fixed, it is fluid. That is why underestimating India is more than a mistake. It is a strategic blindness. It blinds policymakers to the emerging partnerships that India is building with Africa on technology and education. It blinds them to the influence India wields in shaping climate negotiations. It blinds them to the trust India is earning in the Indo-Pacific, not through threats, but through cooperation. It blinds them to the fact that India has become the indispensable link between East and West, between developed and developing, between the past that shaped us and the future that awaits us. And make no mistake, the world is watching. Every statement, every decision, every diplomatic stand taken by India today reverberates far beyond its borders. When it speaks of sovereignty, smaller nations hear hope. When it speaks of multipolarity, rising powers hear recognition. When it refuses to bend, others see a model of resilience. And when those two words silenced America, the silence itself became a global message. The days of taking India for granted are over. So if the future is to be stable, if it is to be just, if it is to be inclusive, then underestimating India is not an option. To misread India's rise is to misread the forces that will define the 21st century. To ignore India's sovereignty is to ignore the new rules being written. To diminish India's voice is to diminish the very idea of balance in global affairs. And in this century, balance will be the difference between cooperation and conflict, between prosperity and inequality, between peace and chaos.